Welcome to the Improv Resource Center Podcast. This is Kevin Mullaney. We are back again with another original new interview. And I'm really excited to have my next guest. He is somebody that I believe I've known you for a very long time, but I only really got to know you a few years ago. I feel like I've known of you, but it was when I moved back to Chicago, I had a chance to work with you as a coach. You coached a duo that I was working on. So let me just introduce who I'm talking about. His name is Ric Walker.
Hello.
Why don't you introduce yourself? Like, how would you introduce yourself at a improv symposium?
Well, okay, I'm Ric Walker. You might know me from my work with the groundbreaking troupe Midwest Comedy Tool and Die that was formed in the late 80s, early 90s, and we toured comedy clubs and colleges back then. And more recently with the Improvised Shakespeare Company, another very popular improv troupe. And I also teach at Second City, among other places.
Okay. And so why don't we talk about, what I would like to do with you is a little bit different from what I normally do. I want to sort of go through your improv history, your history as a performer, not so much to go into depth about like the stories of that. This isn't that podcast where we talk about stories of escapades and so forth, but try and figure out what you got from those different stages of your life, and what kinds of things you might still be using as a teacher from those different stages. So how did you get introduced to improv?
So I went to an arts high school, and the first time I ever did improv, and knowing it was improv, was in a theater class. I went to a theater-based program for high school, junior and senior year. And so we got an opportunity to kind of mess around a little bit every once in a while. And me and my buddies, Mike Loftus and Robert Holmes, we were in school together, and we were just like naturals at it. And it was really fun for us to be goofy and not get into trouble. And we later, those were my high school buddies, and we later formed our first improv troupe some years later.
You formed an improv troupe without any training.
The only training we got was from our then director, Lisa Phillips. And she didn't have much training, which we figured out, in pretty short order, that we were all sort of in the boat together, just kind of figuring stuff out, reading about some improv forms, some improv games, and then putting them on stage because we had regular performances in Columbus.
And this was pre-internet, right?
Pre-internet, yeah.
So you couldn't even go there. And there were probably not very many books at this point. Maybe Keith Johnstone's book. I don't know if you had read that.
No.
Where were you getting your information?
There was a very short-lived comedy sports franchise that started. It only went for, I don't know, I want to say it was just like maybe 6 weeks or a couple months before it closed down. But Lisa got trained there. And so she learned a bunch of short form games, and then she taught them to us. Okay. And so we just kind of figured things out. Like half of us, I was doing open mic nights at the time, along with Mike and Robert, and my brother also was, my brother Ken Walker was one of the original members of MCTD as well. And so we were doing stand-up, and Lisa got some of these people that had been in that short run of comedy sports, and these young open micers, and put us all together and started MCTD.
And are there anything you remember doing back then that you might still do something like it now in terms of rehearsal or classes or anything like that? Something
we used to do because we didn't know any better, and I actually think it was a really good thing for us being novices, was we would we'd get a suggestion and then we'd whisper to each other something like, okay, we'll be in a grocery store, or we would sort of whisper a one item from the who, what, where, and it just got us on track very quickly. We didn't know rules like know each other for at least 6 months or, anything like that. We were doing transaction scenes all the time, but they were hilarious. And so what we were concerned about was, because we were performing in comedy clubs, was laughs per minute. And so that was our main focus. We didn't care about relationships. We didn't care about, shared history, but we did figure out along the way that we would get plenty of laughs if we used those things, but definitely not the way I teach improv now. I was very, very willing to just enter into a scene with a stranger in a waiting room and, figure things out. That was super fun for us.
And part of this overlapped into your college days, or this was all high school?
This is in college.
Oh, this is in college. I'm
so
sorry.
Fast forward a few years, me and my buddies from high school are still buddies. I'm coming back and forth from college. So in my summers home, we started doing stand-up. Late in that summer that we were doing stand-up, the troupe formed. I went back to school to finish, came home for like winter break and played with those guys. And then when I came back after I graduated, we were just playing all the time.
What were you studying in college?
Theater. I have a BFA in acting.
Okay.
So I come at it from an actor point of view, I suppose.
Where were you going to school?
Wright State in Dayton, Ohio.
Wright State?
Wright State, Rowan University.
Are there things you remember, the kinds of things you were learning then in your theater classes that you think still affect you in a direct way?
Yeah, there were definitely some things like the preparation for, as your senior thesis, you had to write a one-person show. And so mine was very character-based with some characters that I still use these many years later, because they were just really effective for me. Instantly connect, I think, with the audience, and so there were things that I learned in that process, especially that I use now as a person that writes, that encourages people writing. I direct a lot of sketch shows, so yeah, there were definitely things that I figured out and learned from my instructors there that I'm still using.
Any examples of other particular exercises or approaches you think that affect how you work?
I like to work physically. I like to encourage my improvisers to approach the work with some sort of physicality. So, for example, there was a lesson that I learned from Leslie Felbane, who was my movement teacher in college, and she studied Lecoq, French movement school. So there's a pantomime exercise that I still use and still teach today, where there are basically 5 parts to a movement, where you see an object, and then you grasp that object, you pick up that object, you see that object again in your hand, then you use that object, and finally you discard that object or get rid of it in some way. So you have to go through all of these, see it. Basically, I always start with like a cherry. You see it, you pluck it, you regard it, you taste it, you discard it. So you go through those steps, and every object requires that kind of care. There's nothing more disconcerting to me, or there's little more disconcerting to me when someone creates a reality and then someone else destroys it, like creating a fire in the middle of the stage. You spend all this time showing us your campsite, and then one guy walks into the fire and is just standing there talking, and no one acknowledges that he's standing in the fire except for that kid in the audience who's like, he's standing in the fire. Why isn't he on fire? He's ruining it. He's ruining the magic for the audience. And that's, an opportunity we have in this form, because we're not using props. We don't need sets. We are our own set designers and our own prop masters. So we have everything at our disposal, but we have to honor it. We have to complete it. We have to take it to completion through the end of the scene. And so I think I definitely learned how to use object work in a very playful and fun way in college, and I think that's pretty core to the way I work on stage and the way I teach.
Where did you head after college?
I have an unrequited love affair with theater. So I'm always trying to, I was always trying to do plays. So I moved back to Columbus for a while and played with my troupe. And then I got some work out of town doing theater, and that led to another job, which led to another job. So I was gone from Columbus for about a year. I was sort of at a crossroads because I didn't love the office politics of a small theater. I was like, I think I'm going to go to grad school. So I looked at a couple programs. I was very frustrated by that process. I did not really want to go back to school. And so I decided to go back to the comedy troupe and dedicate myself to that. So with the plan being, let's make this all of our full-time job. So I returned to Columbus, and we started really treating it more like a business and less like just fun. In short order, we were touring about 40 weeks a year. Our first real improv teacher was Paul Sills up in Wisconsin, in Door County. So we went up and did his summer intensives.
And this is after
years.
You were already touring at this point.
Yeah.
So this is after you had sort of toured around. And what was that like going up to... You went more than once, so it sounds like you had a good experience, or some, or.
Well, it was funny because he really hated us at first. I mean, he thought we were funny, but he would like stop us mid scene and be like, "What the fuck are you guys doing? This isn't improv. This is the 8th week of a sitcom." And stuff like that. He would get really mad. He would throw a chair or something.
What were the basic things he thought you were doing wrong?
So we weren't doing like the Chicago style improv where things are more relationship based. We were mostly concerned about getting laughs, and so and getting them quickly. And we were doing short form, so nothing lasted longer than 4 or 5 minutes. So even if it was kind of stupid and off the rails, it was going to end very soon. So we weren't doing things that needed to be sustainable. And what he wanted us to do was a scene that could be a blackout or could, be 10 minutes long or whatever. That's what he was looking for. He was looking for truth. He was looking for honesty, vulnerability, all of these things that we were not showing. By that time, most of us were doing stand-up, and we were also trying to be cool, 22, 24-year-olds or whatever.
Well, you're also touring around. You're making money, if not an entire living doing it, right?
Yeah. And
so it's kind of hard. I mean, it's hard in that situation, I think, to maybe take notes because you kind of think you know what you're doing already.
Yeah, and definitely there was a core part of our group that felt if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing. Like, oh, this is great that we're studying with Viola Spolin's son, but our show kicks ass, so... Who are you going to listen to, the audience or your teacher,
Can you remember any particular exercises that you did up there?
I do remember that having that experience of being like, oh, because, so here's something I should mention. Before we ever trained, because we started touring so much, we needed people to cover our home shows. So we decided to start a second troupe, a sister troupe, which was called MC Squared. And so we didn't know how to teach improv. So somebody got a Viola Spolin book, Improvisation for the Theater.
Sure.
And we started teaching from that. So we started just, reading the exercises and using that as our guide to teach. And somehow I kind of became the person most in charge of teaching.
The pedagogue.
Yeah, somehow that happened. I guess I do have a natural desire to do it. So studying with Paul Sills, he was definitely using some of his mother's work even late in his life.
Hey there, if you're enjoying this interview on the Improv Resource Center Podcast, you can now support it, like this listener did.
My name is Jennifer O'Sullivan, and I'm an improviser and a producer based in Wellington in New Zealand.
And you're somebody who listens sometimes to the Improv Resource Center?
Yes, I do. I have it on my phone. I listen to it sometimes. I sometimes go back to episodes I really liked and listen to them again because I'm super nerdy.
And you decided to support the IRC podcast through patreon.com?
Because I've gotten so much use so much use and inspiration out of listening to people talk about what they do and how they do it. And also because being someone who makes theater and makes work myself, I know that it's sometimes a little bit thankless, and so it's nice to be able to thank the person who's making it and help them keep making more.
Would you want to shout out to anybody in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, I would love to do a shout out to a festival that I run, which is the New Zealand Improv Festival. It happens annually in Wellington. This year it is on the 6th to the 10th of October, and we welcome guests from anywhere. So if people want to check that out, they can visit the New Zealand, what's the website address? It's nzimprovfestival.co.nz.
I'll have a link to the New Zealand Improv Festival in the show notes, as well as a link to my page at patreon.com. Please consider becoming a supporter yourself. And now back to the interview. So, how did you end up in Chicago? Was there a long period between that period and when you first ended up in Chicago?
So I toured with that troupe, MCTD, for about 6 years. We were like a band, a bunch of dudes in a van, all our egos, and I very much wanted to shake up our show, like either move to LA or Chicago, do something bigger, change our show format, do something, because we had been doing pretty much the same thing for a long time. And there wasn't a lot of support for that idea, and it became increasingly frustrating for me. Plus, you're just with the same people for a long time. It's sort of like a marriage with, 6 dudes. It became unsustainable for me. I needed to move on. And so I knew a bunch of people in Chicago. I thought that seemed like the next logical step before moving to LA. So I was going to be here for like 5 years.
You're on the 5-year Chicago plan?
Yeah, 20 years later, here I am.
And when you got here, did you go to Second City right away? Did you go to I.O.?
No, I actually didn't do any improv. I was like, I've already performed with the best. What am I going to do here? I didn't know what was going on here. I didn't understand the improv scene here. I wish I had. I wish I had. I auditioned. I really wanted to audition for more theater. I wanted to do theater. But I did audition and got a call back for a touring company. And I didn't know that was like a good thing. I was used to being called back for stuff, so I just took it for granted. I started doing a bunch of kids shows, mostly a little bit of grown-up theater, but I was doing a lot of theater, and then I got kind of sucked into doing these live industrials where we would give speeches for corporate clients. They would hire actors to give speeches for corporate clients. So you'd use the skills of an actor, to keep the attention of an audience, to make stuff that isn't that interesting sound super interesting and compelling. And it was so lucrative, and I got to travel all over the world. I spent a lot of time and energy just making myself available for that. So I didn't come back to improv until like around 2002, and I was like, why am I doing this corporate work? This isn't what I really trained for. This isn't where my love is. I want to do something that's more entertainment based. And I called my buddy Joe Janes to see if there was a way I could help him assistant direct something or see what he was up to. And he had just, I don't remember the year exactly, but maybe it was like 2003. He had just become the artistic director at Comedy Sports, and he suggested that I take a class there. And so I did, and I was surprised at how bad at improv I had become, how really rusty I had become. And that was sort of the beginning of the next chapter of improv for me.
So when did you start working with Improvised Shakespeare?
So they had a short run. I don't remember who all was in that very original cast that had a short run in the Skybox at Second City, but it was Blaine and Thomas Middleditch and some other people I don't really know or that didn't continue. So when that run ended, Sharna asked Blaine if he wanted to run of Improvised Shakespeare at I.O., and Blaine jumped on it, had auditions, and he cast me. I think Joe Janes was in that original cast. Lucas Peterson, Thomas Middleditch. There were a few other people I can't think of, and we started that run. That was in 2005 because I know this is our 10th year. So
and was that a pretty big hit right away, or did it take some time to grow?
It took some time to grow. I think it was a small hit, and the cast was really big, so that helped get some people in. But I think it grew steadily. It definitely there were definitely shows early on where there would be 10, 12 people in the audience. But I can only vaguely remember those days. It's hard to remember back before it was pretty full.
Now, one thing that I feel when watching that show is, it feels like there are certain skills that you guys have practiced that normally improvisers don't practice. And maybe that's an illusion to a certain extent of like how much you have worked on the language or the rhythm or talking and rhyming couplets, that kind of thing. Can you give us some insight in the way that show was rehearsed and the kinds of things that you guys did actually practice?
We started with how to create a narrative form along with the language. So we started pretty simple with the language, these, thous, thy, differentiating, making sure we had an understanding of how they were used. And a lot of cheats like just putting an F. You cometh, an ETH at the end of a word, or just using that elongated ED. So it sounds more Shakespearean.
It has some of the signatures of the language without being completely genuine.
Yeah, that's where we started. We definitely, because the show has had the benefit of running for so long, we really didn't stop rehearsing until maybe year 7. I shouldn't say stopped rehearsing. We just don't rehearse very often. But we do 3 shows a week in town. And that, I guess, sort of serves as you're rehearsing on stage. But our rehearsals early on, and for a very long time, was like every 6 weeks or so, we would read one of the plays and study them with a professor from Loyola. And it turned into a couple of different professors from Loyola. Dr. Cutrafello is the main one who uses Shakespeare as a means of teaching 4 major branches of philosophy. And so he really knows the plays, and it was really great to read the plays and then get with the guys and discuss the plays and the deeper meanings and the themes and the tricks of the language. He sort of like decoded it for us a bit. And so all of that stuff just added to our ability to perform it somewhat authentically. The show is, for people that really love it and know Shakespeare, it's pretty authentic. Like, it has a lot of the ingredients from Shakespeare. And for people that just like improv, I'm lucky I get to work with some of the best improvisers in the city. And for people that just love goofball comedy, it's super goofballs, too. So it's got a little something for everybody. I think that's part of why it has been so successful.
Now, one thing I wanted to talk to you about is a few years ago, this was maybe 5 years ago, is when I first really met you, I think. First started working with you, at least. Mm-hmm. I was doing a duo with Amrita Dhaliwal, mm-hmm. and the two of us were looking for a coach, and she knew you, set up some coaching with you. And there are 2 things that I really remember. One is the thing you talked about with the picking the cherry, which actually was very similar to the kind of some of the training that Amrita and I had with Paula Coletta, who we've talked about. We might circle back around to her, but I think I just need to grab her and interview her because she's a
Lecoq.
Yeah, she's
trained.
A Lecoq trained instructor. Anyway, so the things that she was teaching me were very similar, and I hadn't really done it in an improv setting. But the other thing that you worked on with us really stuck with me, and anybody who's had, or a lot of people who've had a workshop with me in the last 5 years have seen a morphed version of this thing that you did with us. And I don't know if you remember it particularly, but it was this thing where one of us would be on stage, somebody doing something. Someone else would come on stage and say a very simple line that isn't necessarily charged with emotion, and then the person who was already out there would react very impulsively in an emotional way.
Mm-hmm. Huge emotional response.
Could you talk about that exercise?
Yeah, so I think the way I used to do it was just a matter of someone says something and you have a huge emotional reaction. I think the way I teach it now is also a yes and exercise. So the emotion, the simple version is you could pre-plan your emotional response. You can have whatever response you want. You could, and someone comes in and he's like, the eggs need to be room temperature before you can use them in the batter. And you can just decide beforehand to be super angry about that or frustrated or, overjoyed because maybe they are at room temperature or whatever. You can pre-plan it. So that's the most simple way. I think a more interesting way is you have to take it in and have the appropriate, whatever your initial feeling is about it, have that and amplify it to an 11. And then you have to add information. So it's not just yes, you have to add something in there through the huge emotional response. And, it's what we should be doing anyway, I think. We should have, and it's just another great tool in your tool belt is if you have an emotional response, you're going to evoke one in your scene partner.
Yeah, I think the thing that I found really difficult about it was you were getting us to, the emotional response I didn't have trouble with, that's fairly easy. I mean, in a sense, it's good to practice it because you don't always do it. Or you don't always push yourself to, I think it's good to push yourself to sort of extremes in rehearsal because it sort of stretches what you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Not so that, not because you want every emotional response to be extreme, but you want to have a range. But then you would make us immediately justify it or immediately come up with a reason. Is that what you mean by the yes-anding, or is it a little bit different than that?
It's a little bit different.
Because for us, I felt like it was more like the justifying. It was like, I'm really happy, and here's why I'm happy that the eggs are room temperature. Mm-hmm. So what would you mean by the yes-anding in terms of that?
So now the way I
filtered through that exercise.
Yeah, usually the way I use it now, because I'm doing it in bigger groups. So we get into our soul train lines, the two lines facing each other. The person from the front of one line will step out. They'll begin an activity. Person from line B will step out, give a line of dialogue. Person from line A will have a huge emotional response and add something, just a bit of information. So
more of a traditional yes and.
More of a traditional
yes and. Filtered through the emotional response.
Exactly. And because I do it as just and then they'll go to the end of the lines. And because I'm trying to keep a lot of people cycling through quickly, I tend to not make that a longer, I tend to not make that particularly scenic. But I find that they kind of discover that they justify. There are other games that I use for justifying emotion, like emo call, emotional call. So tell us
about that one.
So I'll use some short form games as tools to teach good improv skills. So if we're doing like emotion that day and we're cycling through different exercises for emotion, I'll get a list, emotional call. You'll get a list of emotions from the audience in the way you play it as a short form game.
Emo op.
Yes,
is
exactly.
What we used to call it.
Yeah. So you get that list of emotions, and every once in a while you'll throw one out as the scene is going. And so the way it works best, I think, is you have an instantaneous change, and you justify how it makes sense for the scene. And whoever is called to change emotion has first crack at that justification. So that's an emotional justification game. Blind line is a verbal justification game. So it's so when you pick up that line of dialogue, it's not enough to just say it and get a laugh off of that. You have to make it make sense in the context of the scene. So there's a little justification that has to happen afterward. And there's a lot of times where that skill, that ability to be able to justify comes in handy. Someone sneezes in the audience and you're like, oh, those birds, and you close the window or whatever. There's a million ways that we can use justification if we know that, it's a tool at our disposal. I mean, some people do it absolutely naturally. Other people need to have to gain access to that room.
One thing you mentioned was the instantaneous response. Can you talk about why you think that's important to go with an instant emotional reaction rather than to chew it over for a while and then have an emotional response?
To ramp up.
Or to ramp up.
Yeah. I think generally speaking, there's an old phrase that we used to say in MCTD, which is fast is funny, funny fast is genius. And so when you do things quickly and it makes sense, the audience is amazed that you are able to come up with something quickly and that makes sense. And then when it's funny on top of that, they think you're a genius. And I think that's the way I encourage people to play. I encourage my students to play fast but not rushed. Quick in response but not panicked. Never desperate. You always have time. So that instantaneous response is more of a surprise to the audience. It's more dynamic for the scene. It has a bigger effect, and it's hard to keep in low stakes if you have a huge instant emotional response. It instantly kicks up the stakes.
One thing I notice with it is that sometimes people ramp up their emotions thinking that somehow that's more organic or real. And for me, it looks more artificial when somebody when somebody takes their time to get angry, for instance, or takes their time to get excited. And I compare that with real life, and it's like, you don't need, you go from 0 to extremely pissed off in the time that a guy cuts you off on the highway, or that somebody gets in your face at a bar or something like. You don't need to ramp up.
Usually the emotion flips. It flips on like a light switch, and we're just trying to cover up that light. We're just trying to, keep it dark in there. I'm not going to show how pissed off I am, but on the inside, I'm full-blown rage, right?
Right.
And,
emotions. Your emotional system works much faster than you get upset or you get happy or you are excited before you even have the words to know why you are excited or upset.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing you brought up, I want to sort of circle back around is I think as in a lot of long form classes, improv that is specifically long form, which is more what I'm interested in. Sometimes there's almost a taboo about using short form games to teach long form, and yet, at least a lot of people in my generation, we're about the same age, learned short form first. We learned all the games before we learned how to do long scenes and longer forms, and benefited from that, I think. So, are there other short form, things that are typically like short form games that you use in your classes, your workshops to learn specific skills?
So, yes, there are a lot. I like to use short form games. First off, I'm of the belief that every long form player should know how to do a bunch of short form games. A, because it's easier to get paid, to make some money doing short form than it is doing long form. B, I think that the benefits of knowing how to enter into a game, get to the heart of a scene, the things that short form teaches us are on their best display in a long form show, like setting up rules and then playing that game within a long form. We just have to discover what the game is. We just have to we have to hear what the rules are. We have to discover these rules within the context of a scene. And that game could just be like, oh, this is going to be a little verbal game. This is going to be some kind of physical repetition game. These are things that short form teaches very well. And so I use short form all the time. and hopefully to develop your long-form skills.
So what would be another example?
An example would be using halftime, all right? Because especially with young improvisers, it takes so long to get to anything. And so you do that first scene, nothing happens, right? In a full minute, very little happens. You can do that exact same scene in 30 seconds. And then, you know how halftime plays. So I like to tell them, let's do the 30-second version of it. And it creates a shorthand for us. And so we know that we have to get to something much quicker. I like to, this isn't necessarily a short form performance game, but it's a 1-minute scene. It's called Hot Box. And I learned it from Blaine, and I think I've adapted it. But it's 60 seconds, no questions, no denials, no waffling. We have to know the who, what, where within the first 30 seconds. And if you don't accomplish all of these things, if you ask a question at any time, you're instantly called on it. You have to sit down. 2 more actors will come up and they'll start a new scene. And you'll keep cycling through everyone until everyone has successfully made it through the hot box. And it's, and I do it, it's super fun and it's high energy. And, when someone makes a mistake, it just brings out their competitive spirit more than their misery. Because, we keep it fun and it's like, oh, it's hot in the hot box, when someone messes up. And
now you recently, since I worked with you a few years ago, you were on your way out of town for a couple of years.
Yep. I went to the University of Pittsburgh.
And what did you do at the University of Pittsburgh?
Studied performance pedagogy, which is a fancy way of saying a lot of student loan debt. I took 5 classes and taught 2 classes every term, so for a total of 21 credit hours every term. The classes that I taught were acting, intro to acting, and I also taught my own version of an improvisation for the actor class. The classes that I took included like clown and commedia. Those were the really fun ones. The really tough ones where I took some theory seminars, one on race, labor, and gender in the 1930s during the Depression era, Federal Theater Project stuff. Really fascinating. Like everything I took was fascinating on its own. Taking 5 classes at once, including a graduate seminar, can be overwhelming. So sometimes it felt like I would come home and I'm like, it's like hazing. It's like I'm being punished. I would have, 300 pages a week to read in one class, and then another, I'd have to read a play or 2 in another class. And it's like, and those were just 2 of the classes, not even thinking about the planning that I'm doing for the classes that I'm teaching. So it was really intense, really long days. I got to the point where coffee just didn't even work anymore. It just I was so tired all the time. The biggest skill I think I learned was how to manage my emotions so I'm not flipping out on people, getting angry because I'm so super cranky all the time. But it was really fun. And I also got to work on several plays at the same time. There was a lot of fun in that experience. It was intense and it was hard and you never got all your work done, but I got a lot out of it.
Has anything from those classes started to bleed into your improv coaching or your improv classes?
Some things. I think I've gotten better at designing a class or a workshop, the arc of it, how it filters into different types of brains differently. Because of the nature of the teaching that I'm doing now, there's not like written elements, or I'm not requiring reading and stuff like that, because it's not what happens at where I'm teaching, or I'm teaching at Second City, and we're not. It's not that kind of program, but I did learn a lot about how, if I were to do that sort of thing there, how it would apply. But I do think it's made my classroom management stronger. I think it's my ability to communicate to different types of learners.
Would you have some tips about like how, for your average improv teacher, what do you think is something you picked up in terms of class management that would help other improv teachers?
Well, what I view as a common mistake is not really planning the day. To rely on your encyclopedic knowledge of improv, exercises and such, and just walk into class empty-handed without a real plan. I think that's a mistake because it's hard to keep on track. It's hard to figure out exactly what the outcome is supposed to be for the day. And I think it's important to know what the outcome is supposed to be. Now, you can always veer off of that. You get inspired because, something happens organically in class, and so you want to take advantage of that to teach maybe some other lesson. But I think it's really important to walk in with a full game plan and then veer from it as necessary. But, to really understand what you're trying to impart.
I feel like you're talking directly to me on this one. This drives. I remember talking to my girlfriend about this. This drives her nuts. Like, so what do you know? What's your plan for classes today? I'm like, I know what I'm going to cover, but often that is often the case, especially with advanced. I feel with advanced students, it's so much driven by what I see. Mm-hmm. That I'm used to that process. But I can definitely speak from experience that when I have a very specific plan for the class, things just go much better. And, with a certain amount of teaching experience, of course, you can always make a call an audible and change what you're doing. And those moments seem to pay off a lot better the more prepared you are.
If I think of a class, an 8-week class is a series of mini workshops, and I'm building skills throughout. Hopefully, week 1, week 3 will build on what we did in week 2, but also these are some separate skills, but I expect them to move forward with these skills. So if we use emotion pretty early, then I do expect, in week 8 that we're still using emotion. But in that emotion day, and we're doing a bunch of exercises, different ways to get to how to play emotionally. And hopefully a couple of them will hopefully all of them will speak to every single student. But more likely, some are going to be more effective tools for this student, and others are going to be more effective tools for that student. So I like to come at it a few different ways, and encourage the student to utilize them. So the first half of class is usually exercises, and the second half is more practical use in scene work for me. Here's something else, though, I want to mention about things that I think every teacher should do. And I imagine most do this anyway, but to use everything as a teaching moment. And that doesn't mean everything becomes another reason to lecture, but it does mean here's a scene, here's something that just happened in this scene. It may not have any direct correlation to what we were studying today, but I want to point this out because it was really awesome. And so everything can become a teaching moment. Good and bad. The good stuff as well as the bad stuff can be teaching moments.
So recently, one of the members of our ensemble here at Under the Gun Theater came to us with this idea for this improvised mythology show. I knew that you had recently come back into town. I knew that you had done Improvised Shakespeare. It seemed, not the same thing, but somewhat related. And I knew he was looking for a director, and I brought him up to you, and he says, like, oh my gosh, I've already been thinking about him. I've already been thinking about Ric as a director. And so I was like, well, go get him. And so you started working with them on this form, or this show. I guess a show is a better way to think of it, because it wasn't like the mythology form. It was, it was show. Can you talk a little bit about how you put that show together with them, or any kind of particular exercises you thought were really useful for working on this idea of creating a sort of a classical play, not classic, but classical play on stage?
So improvised mythology, the way we started, I thought mostly about, first thing, most improvisers don't really know how to create a long play, to create a single story, 50-minute play. So that's where we started with, how do we do that? So, keeping it pretty simple, you have a chorus that comes out and sings a little Greek song. You have a source scene, a second source scene that's sort of unrelated but related to the question, and introduces our main characters. And then we would go maybe into group game. Then we return to see where our heroes are on the journey. And so we started shaping like the form of just how to tell a story. And we started with 20-minute increments. We started with 20 minutes, worked our way up to 40, worked our way up to 50. At the same time, we started studying Greek mythology, who the gods were, the stories. We started studying the same materials so that we were getting the same stories, and so that we would start putting our version of those up, sort of fractured fairy tales kind of, in a kind of fractured fairy tales kind of way. Then I started to recognize the tendencies of the group and the group dynamic. And I felt like they didn't like to indulge in games, and I really wanted them to indulge in games. So we started doing exercises that like really highlight, how do you play a game? How do you recognize a game? How do you play to your own delight? I even used some like clown exercises with this group, which was super fun for me because I haven't really been able to do that with improvisers, but I should be, and I should more. I kind of discovered with them that it was a really viable tool for a group if it's a really safe environment, because it's not super easy learning to play to your own delight, and there is a difference between faking it and to really doing it. And for some people, it's really hard to really
like clowning in general.
Clowning in general, but the exercises that I was asking them to do, sometimes it's confusing because often in the comedy world we don't get necessarily a lot of pleasure out of it. We're just trying to get the audience to get pleasure out of it. And that's what we get pleasure from, is like, I get pleasure because they laughed. I got pleasure because I got approval. And what I'm asking them to do is to bypass that and to do something that actually is fun for them to do without the reward from the audience. And it's a different way of thinking about performance. It's, I think, super satisfying and super fun, and helps you find game a lot easier. If you start doing stuff that you like and let the audience catch up to you, it's going to be fun for everybody, I believe. So I started recognizing things like that, those kind of tendencies in the troupe, and then tried to find ways to solve those problems. I think we ended up with a pretty good, pretty fun show.
Yeah, it was a very cool show. It did well. It did well for a while. It was a shame it didn't quite it didn't build. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you had that. I don't know, that experience is a kind of a rare experience that you had with Improvised Shakespeare, I think, where you start with something and you get to the first 10 or 12 people, and it's just from there it's a slow build until you're finally selling out houses. But it was a good show. I remember times watching that show, and the reaction when it was done was interesting to me, because normally at the end of a improv show, and I'm sure there were other shows that they did that were like this, people clap and they're appreciative and they have a smile on their face when they leave, and that's a win usually. They applaud, they seem to have a good time, they smiled. But I remember after one, there was just such a genuine, it wasn't like a huge outburst and standing ovation, but you just, this genuine delight in the audience at the curtain call, that they were really happy at the end of it. They had a good time, and you could really feel it at the end. It was different than just applauding and and seeing themselves out. And that's not always true. And I don't know what to attribute that exactly to, but it certainly was one of the reasons why I thought this is going to be something. There's going to be this great show. And
yeah, I was hoping that it would. I can't figure out why there weren't more people, but I think that maybe we just needed the cast to just bring in more people initially so that the word of mouth could start to happen. Possibly. Because I think, word of mouth is...
Well, I think also
helpful.
One thing that I'm learning is some ideas, in that case, I think that the show was good. It was very good. The people who saw it enjoyed it. You compare it to Improvised Shakespeare, though, and for instance, one of the other things that show has going for it is that everybody has some connection to Shakespeare. Yeah. Almost everybody had to read at least one play, and a large portion of the people who might go to the theater at all will have seen a Shakespeare or will have seen an adaptation on film at least. So we have this idea of what we think Shakespeare is. There's a much bigger audience, whereas the number of people who've seen a Greek tragedy on stage or watched some sort of adaptation, I mean, it just isn't the same. It's a much smaller niche of people.
And I do think there's something to just the Brendan Dowling, and I mean, I could mention every single person that plays in Improvised Shakespeare, and I probably shouldn't because I'm not going to mention everyone, but to go see Joey Bland and Brendan Dowling and Blaine Swen on stage.
Oh, and they're terrific too. I mean, it's not just that it's a good idea.
They're so freaking good. I mean, I'm 10 years later, I'm still, sometimes I'm just like with my jaw open and awestruck by the guys that I get to play with, because everyone is so freaking hilarious and amazing and talented, and then you throw something out there and they not only instantly embrace your absurd idea, but then run with it and come up with 10 rhyming couplets for it and a song with a dance and somebody flipping upside down.
So if somebody wanted to, well, let's transition to that. If somebody wanted to see you perform, you're obviously still doing Improvised Shakespeare. What is that? And that's at IO, right? So that's on Friday nights?
Thursdays and Fridays. Thursdays at 8 and Fridays at 8 and 10:30. And those are our weekly in-town gigs. And then we're doing something at the Illinois Shakespeare Festival this summer. Oh, nice. Yeah, so every Saturday we'll be down there.
You're down there every week for the Illinois?
July and August, I think.
That's a really nice venue. Have you ever been down there before?
I haven't, but I'm going to do 3 of them next month.
Yeah, they have an outdoor venue. I think they have an indoor venue as well. I've seen shows there over the years. I mean, I think the first one I saw was definitely in college, maybe even high school, because I live nearby. And then the most recent one was just a couple years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago. I went to see a show there, and they have this beautiful outdoor space, purpose-built for their shows in the summer. Really nice. They'll have a lot of fun performing there, and I'm sure they'll eat it up. They get good audiences for their regular shows. So
awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
And do you teach what program do you teach in over at Second City, or do you teach regularly over there?
I teach regularly. Right now, I'm teaching a lot of IFA, which is Improv for Actors.
Okay.
And I teach in the beginning program, A through E, usually more D or E, but I can teach in any level of it.
Let me end with some sort of more like a fantasy question, I guess. So what would, if you were going to go somewhere, let's say you were going to go to England and or Australia, and you had a group of very experienced people who have they don't need to be taught the basics. They're advanced improvisers? Like, what would you go and teach them that you think like that really gets you excited and that you think more people should know how to do, or I don't know, like what would be your you have 2 days.
Something
2 days to teach them, and what would be your absolute dream workshop to teach?
Something that I've been very interested in more recently, and that I'd like to teach more of, is how to play without speaking, like where the laughs are, because we have such a tendency to just like, my whole body is just a big mechanism to move my mouth around so that I can talk and beep, bop, beep, and do weird things. So how do we use our whole body to express ourselves? How do we perform without constant talking? How do we use the moments? How do we use our environment? How do we use our character relationships to convey and still be full of action, but not full of just words? Because I think it's fun to play with, how do you use your breath? So, for example, there's an exercise, a clown exercise that I learned some time ago, which is an entrance. You take in a breath, you move down center, you breathe, you do any act as if you do any physical action, like raising your eyebrows one at a time, as if it is the most dynamic performance the audience has ever seen. And you take your bow, and then you move to the exit, and just before you exit, you look back at the audience, you take a breath, and you exit. And it's amazing how, when you really do it fully, how connected the audience becomes and how much more they laugh with just breaths. And if you can get that kind of mileage out of just using your breath, how much more of a dynamic performer are you going to be when you really learn to master that?
Yeah, it's, years and years ago when I first started, I would have never taken a clown class. I think, I don't know, for whatever reason, I was snobby about it. I don't know. It was a very dumb mindset, I think, when I was younger. Because when I finally did take it, it was so, physical theater and mask and also some red-nosed clown stuff. It was amazing to me how connected that sometimes. I mean, it was always different. Sometimes people would come in with their red nose on, and they would do something, and you would, something about it would feel dishonest, and you would just hate them. Like I would just hate people, for a moment. Not in real life, but as their clown in that moment, I would just be like, well, that's a terrible clown. Get off the stage. But then somebody else would walk in and do something, and it would feel so genuine in a way, and it was so moving or funny, and they had this stupid nose on their face, and it's such an interesting experience, because I think, like Red Nose Day, I hate Red Nose Day because I think it's a lot of people who don't really there's no real understanding of what clowning is, and they just put a red nose, and it's like, haha, I'm funny because I have a red nose on. It's like, no, it's like it's learning to be this very full, vulnerable, real thing with happen to have a mask on, or happen to be, concentrating on your breathing, or like there's all these technical things that go into it that actually make it work, that you don't realize. And so often you see it done in popular culture very, very badly, and think that all clowning is just dumb. Right. When in fact it's such a powerful tool for a performer. If you can learn how to perform well with a red nose on your face, or with a full mask on your face, you can, perform that much more fully as in a more conventional setting.
So the thing that I love about mask work is that it reveals more fully. It reveals the body. It shows you what the body is doing. And so the clown, the red nose, is, like you said, it's the smallest mask. So it's still revealing it's still revealing the body. And you know that statistic that it's something like, I don't know, 68% of all communication is your body language, 35 or whatever it is percent is the tone in which you speak, and then only about 6 to 9% is the actual words that you're using. That most communication is that body. And so when a physical presence is there with the mask on, you're seeing 100% of that communication is through their body. And then with a clown, because most clowns don't talk that much, they're not very verbal usually, it's still revealing even more of. And so the reason you hate them probably is because they aren't being honest with their body.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
When and it's a class situation, so we're all learning. And I'm sure there were moments when I walked on stage with the red nose and people hated me. But it was that visceral, and it wasn't. They weren't saying anything necessarily. There weren't any words in the exercise. But it would be. I think it would be the difference. You know, sometimes people would put on some sort of pretense of what they thought a clown should be. Mm-hmm. And it was dishonest. Something about it was dishonest or pretentious, and I hated it. And then other times when they would come out, and it was just so. They were something about the exercise would just allow them to be completely honest with what they're experiencing in that moment. Whether it's feeling abused by another clown on stage, or whether it was taking delight in someone else's abuse, or feeling scared, or feeling nervous, or feeling joy, and because it was genuine, and that's what I was noticing, that genuine feeling through their body, it was really entertaining in a way that a lot of theater isn't.
Yeah. Well, you have to be completely willing to be vulnerable. And for a lot of people, a lot of actors, and a lot of people in general just are not interested in really revealing their true self. They have a self that they want to project out there. I want to project the cool Ric Walker, not the vulnerable Ric Walker. But you have to be completely willing to go there for comedy purposes as a clown, or maybe not comedy purposes, but that's what a clown does, is like completely raw, completely out there.
Well, I guess if you've made it this far into this interview, you're probably the kind of person who would want that in their performance. I don't know. We're going to end it there. Thanks so much for being on the Improv Resource Center podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
You've been listening to the Improv Resource Center podcast. I blog at kevinmullaney.com. You can follow me on Twitter at IRCMullaney. And you can also support me at a site called Patreon. It's patreon.com/Mullaney. It's a little bit like a Kickstarter, but for people who create content like this. So every time that, if you want to donate $1 to support the show for every episode, then you can go there and you can pledge $1 per episode. Maybe you want to pledge $5 per episode, and you only actually donate when I actually release a new episode of the podcast. So check that out at Patreon. The producer of the show is Scott Smith, and all the music you hear is by Gringo Motel.